Hello and welcome to Push Your Glasses Up. I'm Mikey. Today I'm joined by Spencer Perry to talk about Evil Dead Rise, finish off a promise we made many months ago by doing all the other Evil Dead movies, and then capping this one off. Waited till October just because there wasn't a ton going on this month, so spooky season made sense. Before we get to it though, if you enjoy these videos, please like them, subscribe to the channel, and if you prefer the podcast in audio only format, you can find us on podcast services everywhere. Let's talk about Evil Dead. Spencer, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. We're going to go a little bit quick on this episode due to unforeseen circumstances on my end with tech stuff. So we're just going to get right into it. How did you feel about this Evil Dead movie, Evil Dead Rise?
In short, liked it, didn't love it. And I think part of that maybe isn't the movie itself. Part of that is the gargantuan expectations I had as a result of the early screenings and the pre-screenings and the hype that had built from it.
Fair.
Which is to say, you know, that's on me. That's not a fault of the movie. But the thing I admire about it is that it's not afraid to cross lines and do things that not only many modern horror movies are afraid to do, but especially modern studio horror movies are afraid to do. And this movie has no problem with doing things that not only are people not expecting to happen, but then doing it with, like, you know,
gusto. Nice. Yeah, I'm quite a bit more positive on it than you are, I think. But part of that could be because I did wait to see it until just before we were recording this. I had set up that basically we were going to do this episode for October for Halloween stuff, and you saw it right away, right when that hype was like at its highest. And I think and I think I benefited from it being allowed to sort of fade away by the time I saw it. But yeah, it was, you know, like 2 or 3 months of oh, I can't wait till you see Evil Dead Rise after that festival premiere. And understandably, I think it makes sense that you could have had a little bit of like not a letdown, but like a little bit of that feeling of like, well, this isn't quite what I wanted it to be.
I don't even know if it's not that it wasn't what I wanted it to be, but my feelings were sort of like, that's it.
Right. Yeah. For me, I came out on the other end of it being like a lot of those festival goers, very high on it, because I didn't have that in the back of my head as much. I was just, you know, I was still excited to watch it through the year, but I was just like, well, I just schedule it out for a little while from now. It's fine. But I think that from things like performances to how this script allows us to like actually care about the characters, which is something that 2013 doesn't really do as much. It doesn't do a good job juggling main character and supporting cast. It's just that's sort of the in-between movie where the original is the hero with the fodder, and then it almost 2013 tried to do a little bit more, and I kind of like, I commend it for trying to do it, but it still didn't know how. Whereas this movie, like connecting with this family of characters, it does a really solid job of making you care before bad things happen, which is something that this franchise mostly hasn't ever done. But like you were telling me before, like you're told to like Bruce Campbell. Yeah. You're not allowed to like him.
Right. He's your avenue in these first 3 movies. You know, the films, you know, they have such a brisk pace and such a specific tone. They are very, you know, singularly heroic movies where it's like, all right, here's the lead. You know, even the first one's a little different just because like it's not quite so obvious from the beginning that Bruce is the lead, but
Yeah.
Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, obviously.
It wasn't quite as much of the pulp horror where it's like comic book character kind of.
Yeah. But even the 2013 remake, even though it establishes Mia and her brother as sort of like your central protagonists, it still brings in these other characters that don't add a lot to the narrative beyond simply being people that are there who
here's the asshole nerdy guy, here's
find the book, and then here's the one that's going to cut her arm off, and then here's the guy who's this going to happen to. And Evil Dead Rise does such a much better job of introducing these people with these really unique circumstances and personalities, and it's definitely one of the movie's strengths.
And we'll get to it later, but like how some of them perform as Deadites is also phenomenal. But I think with this movie, where it's not flawless, I did come out on the like very high end of it, where I do think it's one of the better movies in this franchise. And I think it kind of reminds me of Dan Trachtenberg with 10 Cloverfield Lane, where I don't know much of Lee Cronin's previous work before this, any of it really. But the way that this kind of bust on the scene, not just with the hype, but just like how I am reacting to it. It reminds me of Dan Trachtenberg coming out with 10 Cloverfield Lane and being like, man, that was great. What a surprise. I can't wait to see what he does next. And then he does Prey. So I'm like, I'm really excited for Lee Cronin's Prey, because this movie really set up like, and whether or not it's a sequel to this, which we were discussing before starting the podcast, like how has the sequel not been greenlit yet or announced yet? Because it's like, it made a lot of money.
It made a lot of money, and Evil Dead movies are something that they're constantly talking about new movies.
Yeah.
Like how you just had like the biggest success of the franchise in decades. How are you not immediately talking about the next movie?
Yeah. Like there's more word of mouth ever than ever before with this, even with like Bruce coming back to do the TV show and stuff. It didn't have like,
I think you could argue that this is, you know, maybe the first time that Evil Dead has like broken into the mainstream is with this movie, because, you know, look, those first two are definitely like horror fan movies, gorehound movies, and then Army of Darkness is kind of a famous flop,
right?
And the Evil Dead remake did well, but not, and I think part of that is, you know, it was of a time. It's an extreme movie of the 2010 horror scene that already is another hurdle to getting it to break through to the mainstream. But I think
there were also 900, like whether they're remakes or pseudo reboots or whatever. Yeah.
But then I think the festival hype is what really got this one through. I genuinely think you could call this one, you know, this is something that like even people that aren't like tapped into horror were aware of and might have even seen this one.
And also marketed. It was marketed, like not just well, but it was marketed. But yeah, I we can get more into specifics now, but like I think the way that this movie handles things with like visual references to the old movies, we discussed this before of like, you know, the vines scene, even in the originals, but particularly in the 2013 scene, like I don't want to watch that anymore. So I think that this movie does a good job of not just adapting it to be in the city, like within an elevator, but it does a really good job modernizing it to be, you know, not as gratuitous. Like this movie knows when it should be gratuitous and when it shouldn't be. And when they do the visual reference to the vine scene of when Alyssa Sutherland's character is like all tied up in the elevator, they let it stop when it should have stopped. Because like you can put the pieces together if you know the franchise enough to like, okay, we know what this is. And if you don't know what it's referencing, you don't have to be traumatized by that visual, which is good, because I think blood and guts and gore, like trying to like quote unquote traumatize the audience with that is like, that's totally fine. I think there's certain lines that get crossed if you're doing it today that like it flew back then, but like I think 2013 is when like it already wasn't flying. So like,
right.
I think they do a good job modernizing stuff like that while still honoring the past of it too.
Yeah. And I think this is the kind of movie, the kind of franchise movie where you can get away with doing those, I don't want to say tropes, but like, you know, the visual allusions to the things that fans are
the
aware
fan servicey-ish stuff.
The recurring visual motifs,
Yeah.
you know, the vines, the books themselves. And, you know, this is another one of the things that sort of pulled me out of the movie was that, you know, you're already making Evil Dead 5, so you're already referencing other Evil Dead movies. You don't then need to add on, you know, big homages to other horror movies. You know, there's obviously the gigantic Shining reference with the elevator with the blood.
Yeah.
I'm certain there's another one, but I cannot think of what it is. And, you know, you're already doing Evil Dead stuff. We don't need to know how much of you like The Shining.
Yeah, too. I did pop for that in a very popcorny way, but yes, completely unnecessary. Like it even like when it just holds on the elevator for a second, I was like, oh, I know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are moments like that where I'm like, yeah, it's not flawless. It's definitely not flawless, but it didn't hold me back at all from like letting the stupidness of like a thing like that you know what, I'll eat a Fruit Loop. I'll it's fine. It's fine. But yeah, how did you feel about like the performances of, well, now we'll really get into specifics though. Like the performances of these characters in general, I think are great all around. For the family, I think the side characters are like whatever, the hallway people. But with like Alyssa Sutherland's character and Gabrielle Eccles' character, I think they do such a phenomenal job as Deadites once they turn that it's like, it's unbelievable. Like it's some of the funnest stuff I've seen in any horror movie.
Yeah, it's probably the best Deadite acting of the franchise, if only because they have that sinister edge to the Deadites that I like to see. You know, the playful, sinister, manipulative personalities that are that I think works best with those characters as antagonists. But also, you know, like we said before, the movie does such a good job of setting up these characters and giving the audience different pathways into like, all right, there's so many, you know, different archetypes within, you know, the mom, the children, her younger sister who doesn't have kids but is pregnant, you know,
which also, by the way, there the thing that people thought was subtext in this movie that was like I cannot believe certain people thought that this was an anti-abortion movie. It's so insane.
But the movie gives the audience so many different avenues to get in. You know, like there's so many characters for anyone to latch on to, and that's one of my favorite things about it, is not only does it have that element, but then it's not afraid to kill off characters, be it, you know, actually kill them off or turn them into Deadites, when so many other movies wouldn't. They would, you know, that element of the story wouldn't even make it past the page.
Kids are off the table. Like, usually,
kids are off the table is sort of a huge one. Whereas like this movie is not afraid to kill kids, which is like something that I'm.
Although we knew one of them wouldn't. You knew like the youngest one was safe.
Yeah, she was gonna make it.
Yeah, she's like 6 years old. You're fine.
Yeah.
I'm in the same page of you of being like, I'm so glad that they went for it, because like this is Warner Brothers. Like it's one thing if it's like a low budget indie thing or whatever. And I mean, this isn't like a high budget movie, but like with horror, it's not huge, but like it's a decent budget for this style of movie.
And it makes you wonder, this movie was originally going to be just a Max exclusive, and then like so many other films in recent years had like an uproarious test screening to the point where the studio was like, why are we dumping this on streaming when we could make a ton of money putting this in theaters at the right moment? And it makes you wonder if they were able to get away with the things that they get away with because they, when they were making the movie, they didn't have the hurdle of like, all right, but you're going to be playing in movie theaters, so you've got to appeal to moms and dads in Nebraska as well.
Yeah. And it's, it probably still would have been MPAA rated, but like they don't have to, like, they're always going to be going for an R, but like with a streaming movie, I think that they would be allowed to like go further as opposed to like for a theater.
And I think that's where they landed is they made the movie under the thinking of, well, this is going to Max, so the people that want to see it are going to find it and watch it, so we can give them what they want, but also we can push the boundaries a little. And then I guess those test screens were so good that the studio was like, all right, you're going into theaters now, and then they, I think they're able to navigate the trenches of making a horror movie for theatrical release in the modern era by first being made for streaming.
By accidentally not.
Yes, by accidentally not doing it.
Yeah. I don't know how much extra there is to talk about this movie, because it is like one of the aspects that I like about it is that it is translated to an apartment building really well. They found a way to do the like a cabin in the woods is somehow both like hugely vast but also claustrophobic, and I think they did a really good job of figuring out like, oh, an apartment in like a building where you can't go up and down on floors in a big city is basically the same feeling. So I think they did a really good job of translating that, and it allows this movie to just be focused, which I think a lot of horror movies, like, you get into like the Conjuring stuff, and the Conjuring is good, but like that's a wide scope, whereas like this just, for Evil Dead, you want it to be small scale and focused, and you want like to experience the kills and the like grotesque moments. You don't want it to just be like vibes and huge universe, right? So it's cool how they did that, while also like I maybe I knew this ahead of time from like a review or something, but I totally forgot about it by the time I was watching it, where it's like, oh yeah, there's more than one book. And I was like, that's such a good way to handle this and like anthologize it a little bit, where you can do multiple side stories that don't have to be like Ash's Evil Dead Prime. Sure thing. But now we have these other books to like cause little isolated stories to pop up across wherever they end up. So yeah.
Well, and to your point, the film does a good job of transplanting that storytelling of the cabin isolation within this new location, an apartment building, but it doesn't expand the scope of the narrative to a degree of like, any other horror franchise that would be like, all right, now we're doing zombies.
It's not an MCU yet kind of thing.
Right. But it's also like, it's not, they didn't like fall to the level of like just replicating, Wreck, the found footage Spanish horror movie of zombies in an apartment building, or like, Demons and Demons 2, where it's like, demons running everywhere and at all levels, or, it's not The Raid with Evil Dead. It's, it is the DNA of Evil Dead, just in a new place. It's now refreshing.
I kind of want Evil Dread. God,
with Ash returning, that it has to be, right?
Yeah, it's Ash and Judge Dredd. really bouncing off each other like a couple of really grumpy guys.
It could work.
I think it could. So get me on the comic line, guys. Yeah, I can't remember if this is we talked about that. I think this was the original recording that didn't come through, but you had talked about how you felt it was unnecessary for them to do the actual cabin stuff. Yes. Despite the title card being just phenomenal. Which I think was a little bit wasted by being put into the marketing, but you felt it sort of took away from the fact that they were successful in translating this into a different environment.
Yeah. I think my problem with it, that opening scene and the final scene is that they don't add anything to the movie itself other than, winking at the camera of like, here's what you have come to expect from Evil Dead. And then also, when they reveal that, the opening 4 or 5 minutes are actually like a couple days later, and the way that they connect it all at the end and in the final sequence is like, it's sort of the movie showing you, okay, but the Necronomicon and the Deadites are on the pathway back to a cabin, where it's like, but we didn't
do
need
they have
that.
to be?
Like, we've seen that enough times.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you that it's like unnecessary. I think it worked for me in the same way that the elevator worked for me, where it's like, you didn't need to put that in there, but you know what? I smiled a little bit just because I mean, it's a little bit different than the elevator thing, because what worked for me is because of that non-linear timeline that they revealed with the end of the movie. If it was just that if they just tagged on at the end, like, and now we're back at the cabin without doing the setup at the beginning, I don't think it would have worked at all. But for me, it worked because of that, like, oh, this was a little bit clever. Like, in the fact that it's not clever that they're going back to a cabin, I think the way that they handled it was a little bit clever. But also, it is a little bit weird to think about, like, well, we have multiple books. Why are they going back to a cabin? Like, they don't have to. But yeah,
I'm just their DNA, they're like, we gotta be in the outdoors. We're woodsy people.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm really, really enthralled with the idea of where we can go with Evil Dead from here, because this is, it's not the 100% freshest take on something. Like, they modernized it and they changed the location. That's ultimately, you could boil it down to that. But I think it is the right stepping stone to a rejuvenated version of the franchise, where it's not going to be like, it's Evil Dead. It never should be 100% like a new thing, but it's just enough of one that it's like, it's exciting to think about where we go from here.
My hope is that the success of the movie doesn't lend the franchise to simply becoming, in years past, action movies would be described as Die Hard on a blank or Taken on a blank. My hope is
Evil Dead on a boat.
Yeah, Evil Dead on a boat, Evil Dead at a parade. I don't know. Evil Dead,
planes, trains, and automobiles.
Park.
Yeah.
I hope
Evil Dead at a theme park, though, for me, as like the Disney guy, I'd be okay with that. Especially since that's like one of my favorite levels in like Left 4 Dead and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, like I think another thing that they did fresh with this, which I think you partly agree with, but partly found a little bit like it was almost resting on its laurels with how it was handled. The monster at the end of this, where it is the amalgam of the different family members and stuff, I think is such a cool new direction for the franchise to go, because typically it is like an entity without a body, and then the Deadites, which are just like Looney Tunes zombies, right? So like you have those two things, and you know, you get into Army of Darkness and there's like skeletons and whatever, but it's like it's still just like a human shape thing. Whereas with this thing that my prime example was like the thing you become in the game Inside, and your follow-up example was the Rat King in The Last of Us Part 2. I think that it is a really cool direction to have this go, where it's not getting like, it's not like there's a dragon suddenly that's like in this. It's still like originally a humanoid thing that just got smushed together. So it's really grotesque and like Cronenberg-y, where it's not getting too far away from the spirit while still like dipping its toe in weirder stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't love that last monster just because of what we said. It feels so derivative of the Rat King and the Inside blob, but it is still cool to see it on screen, and the way that they handle fighting it, and the way they handle photographing and it, and then you know the build up to revealing it on the screen.
The movement is what really got me. Like
it's all directed really well,
and
it's still fun to see play out in the sequence, even if the design itself isn't original.
Yeah, and I like the other thing that you were saying, I think, is the way that it's disposed of is like, yeah, we've kind of like Fargo did that, right? So like
Fargo did the wood chipper, you know, almost 30 years ago.
So it's not like we haven't seen those things before, but it's just like it's good visuals though. and it allowed for the gratuitous like storm of blood to happen, right? So it's like,
well, especially because it's the movie. The movie at that point, it's sort of, there hasn't been like a chainsaw sequence, and the movie is sort of playing with your expectations of chainsaw imagery within Evil Dead. And correct me if I'm wrong, but chainsaw, it doesn't work. It doesn't have gas.
The monster has it at first.
Okay.
And then like I forget exactly, because the end of the movie she leaves with it. So like Beth does. So like it's working. It's just that I think the monster started with it. And then there was some sort of thing between them where like it gets taken away and Beth ends up with it.
You know, it's the movie playing with those expectations in a fun way.
Yeah.
And in a way where it's like, it's really making you think that one thing's going to happen. And then it's like, no, we're actually going to do it even bigger than that thing.
Yeah. It's like subverting the subversion to like just make a bigger version. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause otherwise, like without like a wood chip, like of course also like why is there a wood chipper in the basement garage of a skyscraper apartment? But you know, whatever, because what else are you gonna do to get a blood storm happening? You would have to go Blade and like do the rave scene, which, you know, then we would complain that they did the Blade thing. So it's like,
right.
I think it's totally fine that they had to do that, because it's also like, at least it's keeping with the roots of like, this is something you would maybe see at a cabin. Like I know we discussed like staying away from the whole cabin aspect and stuff, but like I think it works enough in a like trees are in the woods, so this is but yeah, I legitimately I think this is my second favorite one, just because it is like, you know, 2 is essentially a remake of 1, and then 2013 is essentially another remake of 1.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think that just having the fresh take and atmosphere is enough to put it over, but it's just also, I think it is successfully done and like enough that it differentiates it from everything else in a way that I think it helps to elevate it above, you know, the first one's a classic, of course. It is also extremely flawed. None of them aren't flawed, but like that first one is very much a couple of kids in the woods making a movie. Whereas this actually has like a little bit of that vibe, but like so with somebody in charge that knows what they're doing. Even though it is like the fresh-faced writer-director, essentially.
Yeah.
That vibe still comes through to me where it's like they want to try things. And that's like the most exciting part of this, is that it's like I was saying before, I can't wait to see what his Prey is going to be. I hope it's a sequel to this. We'll see. But yeah.
I think I rank it, it's middle of the pack for me.
Yeah.
I think if I watched it again, free of the shackles of the hype and, going in knowing what it is, I think I would appreciate it even more. And, it's blasphemous to say to some, but I like it more than Army of Darkness. Army of Darkness is like my least favorite of the whole thing, even though it is fun for what it is, but it's just not the tone of Evil Dead that appeals to me.
It's too much Looney Tunes. Yeah. I think that's the one thing we like for sure agreed on when we talked about the older movies, where it's like, yeah, I think I still prefer it over 2013, but like it's sort of like 1 and 2 were real high, and then Army of Darkness was like couple steps below, not even just like right next to it. Like if there were more movies in this franchise, I think it would be probably lower down for me as well. But it's just because it's Army of Darkness. Like,
yeah,
even the movie's title knows it's not an Evil Dead movie. So like, yeah. I think it's totally fine, even though it is like sacrilegious to admit it, I think. But yeah. Spencer, that's it for Evil Dead Rise, I think. So thank you for coming back and putting up with these tech issues that started off.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully we don't have to wait a decade for another Evil Dead movie. Yeah,
absolutely. Because with how much I liked it in particular, I'd be pretty mad if we had to do that. I have a feeling that we'll get an announcement, hopefully, in the next year.
Like, I'd be surprised if there wasn't another one in the next 2 years.
Yeah. So, because like, listen, if they continue to do the right thing and keep it like a small focused area and not try to expand it, it shouldn't take them too long to shoot. So, yeah. Cool. Well, once again, thank you for coming on. And until next time.